Yeah, thank you. And as far as I know, both terms refer to the main targets of the late Princess Gagliani Badana, the founder of this institution. And I read it like that she was interested in how can new and traditional musics made accessible for as many people as possible, but without losing any kind of authenticity and individuality. And how can traditional and contemporary music be sustained and further developed when the current exposure to music is almost limitless, but limited at the same time? And if I remember the talk of Anand this morning, I think there was a lot of these things in it that concern myself since 40 years, mainly in Indonesia, but I was very happy that he works in the same direction here. So finally, I started to reflect on these two terms regarding their global meaning in music, its social relevance, distribution, as well as in music practice. And by that, I came across a very, for me, central issue called the role of the reproduction technology and its development. It, in a way, links very good to my predecessor here, talking about the radio station. It has a lot to do with that as well. And as an introduction, I want to recall and describe shortly the unique and always changing role music has taken in our world, including some aesthetical implications. Before the 20th century, music was basically not different compared with other art forms. There was music in connection with religious practice, probably one of the most earliest form of it all at all. There was music as social tool within a given society, including entertainment, social gathering, and private activities, as, for example, singing cradle songs. It was even a tool for ethnic identity or identification. Or one may call it, as a summary, music as communication and community practice in the widest sense. During the 19th century, music as an autonomous art form came into being, at least in Europe, or its counterpart, the popular music, as a finally completely industrialized product. Today, it is mostly driven by digital technologies that started to permeate music since around the 1970s. To make things not too complicated, I think it's reasonable to state that all forms still exist. But it also means that music was generally produced or practiced in defined situations or under special circumstances. And here, the paradigmatic change in the 20th century seems to begin. First around the 1920s because of the advent of reproduction technology, but especially during the last 50 years. Aesthetical consequences? I cannot avoid the impression that today the quality of active listening to music seems to wither away and is worldwide almost replaced by a passive sound reinforcement. I'm aware that this statement is slightly blunt or too superficial, but it is helpful as a starter to understand my intention. We can hardly escape the environmental pollution with sound, and I do not dare to call it music actually, although most people would perhaps disagree with me. In many situations, music has degenerated to a mere sounding wallpaper that is constantly around us in restaurants, shops, public transports. A special segment of it is called muzak. You may have heard that term. And if that weren't enough, many people alienate themselves by walking around with small headphones or even in-ear headphones. They function again as personal wallpaper, as I call it, as well as isolating people from their respective environment, which may even become very dangerous in everyday life. I have an electric car, and I have already almost 3 accidents because people didn't hear me again, because the car was very smooth, but they didn't hear anything around the environment. Some years ago, the German newspaper Die Zeit made a survey in German grammar schools, and that came to the result that more than 65% of the pupils do their homework while being under constant sound reinforcement. Isn't that frightening? To be honest, for me it is. No other art form has been misused and degenerated in such a degree like music. Hence, those music forms that are still considered as art have a harder life today compared with any other art, because the shortly described common practice and the encompassing exposure lead to an unconscious conditioning of frightening extent. Nevertheless, this problem shall not be my primary concern in this paper, but it is necessary to have it in mind, because this is one of those continuously threatening shadows in the background that I have mentioned in my title. At the beginning, and based on these pre-assumptions, I would like to mention three aspects in an exemplary way. The era of knowledge through a fake accessibility. Before we had electronic media, and in a way before the technology of reproduction, one had to invest a lot of energy for in-depth study in music and practice accordingly to learn new things. Music was, so to speak, implanted or stored in the mental system via audiation. And it was always possible to be recalled, as Edwin Gordon, Wilfried Krohn, and others have described in their groundbreaking studies on music learning and understanding in the 1980s and 1990s. Today, the situation is different. We know where we can find something, but we less know the something itself. We store the place, but less the content of the object. Second, the problem of quality perception, accessibility. Who still has a quality stereo sound system at home or in his or her academic teaching places? My current observation tells me that the existence of such equipment is decreasing. At its best, people have good headphones. Thanks a lot here at PGYIM. You have heard that I'm currently teaching here for a while. You are still very good equipped. That's very nice, I like that. But even at some music departments in Germany, I had to use my control speakers of the laptop during presentations because there was no stereo equipment anymore. Even under musicians, it is often common practice that those small in-ear plugs, headphones, with a limited range and limited dynamic level are used daily, although these devices are hardly convenient even for popular music. And finally, I do not dare to speak about possible damages in the ear. Unfortunately, there is still not much in-depth research, at least according to my knowledge. But my limited knowledge on the biology of the ear tells me that it can hardly be healthy to listen music in such a way. Third, the craziness of premieres in contemporary music, sustainability. Perhaps that point sounds a little off the record, but it's not. It is a quite good example for our problem. Today, or at least since some decades, it has become an increasing tendency that festivals with contemporary music present more than 70% premieres. And around 70 of these premieres will normally not be performed for a second time. In other words, a type of music that is hardly accessible for most people will never experience a kind of sustainability as a new music form, but will disappear in the unlimited realm of the acoustically stored world. I do not argue against the classical masterworks and their numerous performances, but before classical music practice resembles a constant walk through a museum, it is strongly hoped that new oral experience are as important as the repetition of our classics. I just want to remind us that until the end of the 19th century, it was almost compulsory that in concert programs, most pieces have been new pieces. And it's only then later it started in a different way. And contemporary music festivals did not exist in the 19th century. So let's do again a short historical review, but now with a more technological approach. Before the 20th century, the acquaintance with a new piece of music was only possible through one's own practice or via going to a concert or a performance. Every performance had its own singularity or uniqueness, despite the existence of a notation, if there was one. There were few existing and potentially reproducing music machines, like the piano, the Velter-Mignon technology, later the player pianos, but they did not yet change the uniqueness of a live music experience in those times, because it was just too marginal. But the situation changed when the first shellac and soon after that the vinyl records came into being, or in other words, the rising existence and power of the so-called reproduction technology and industry. As many of you may know, it was the sociologist Walter Benjamin who quite early recognized that the appearance of reproduction technology would cause a fundamental aesthetical change in music perception. I have already used Benjamin's quote in my online keynote from 2020 here, but I would like to repeat it again in this context. What becomes stunted in the era of technical reproduction of the artwork is its aura. The process is symptomatic. Its importance goes far beyond art itself. One could say generally that the reproduction technology detaches the reproduced from its tradition. By multiplying the reproduction, that technology exchanges the unique one with its masses. The question about what is the real or the original does not make sense anymore. But when the measuring standard regarding the real or the original in art production fails, the whole social function of arts has changed. Before, the artwork was a kind of ritual. The new realm is mere policy. This was written in the 30s. I think it's remarkable that he already saw these problems in practice. After the vinyl record, we had the cassette, and shortly later, digital storage possibilities, like a DAT cassette, compact disc, and the current relevant streaming offers. One could argue that such a development is extremely positive regarding accessibility. The access to music of seemingly any kind becomes much easier and does not cause high costs anymore. It could even be praised as a socializing force for music distribution, from which especially less popular music forms, theoretically, could profit enormously. And even class-orientated approach to music could be minimized as well, theoretically. However, we all know that this was not and still is not the case. Let's give you some examples. At least until the 1950s, shellacs and vinyl recording still had a kind of singularity, at least regarding their production. Early technology allowed a recording of more or less 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Editing was not yet possible. Jazz groups, for example, had to start from the beginning again when someone had played a mistake or a solo didn't work and they had to repeat then the whole piece. No wonder that most jazz solos, just mentioned that, no wonder that most jazz solos at that time had been thoroughly prepared. The so-called spontaneous character of an improvisation has been a, though long established, mythos. Just listen to early recordings by Duke Ellington or Count Basie and compare, from the same piece, compare various recordings, and you will wonder how similar the solos are. So that's the spontaneity. But they are still good solos. It's just people always think it's so spontaneous. It is mostly not. So, but the situation changed with so-called multi-channel technology and overdubbings, and more manipulations were possible. The album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles from 1967 would not have been possible without these new devices. And so was it with the first recordings by Frank Zappa, like Freak Out or Absolutely Free. Ultimately, it was Frank Zappa who went there farthest in a procedure that he called xenochrony. With his very advanced recording technology, he was able to produce recordings that were based on live and studio recording cuts tutti as well as solo parts, from different performances over a time span of more than 30 years. And all the other recording gadgetry today cannot be explained here, and it must be clear that in the digital age, the possibilities of manipulation are almost unlimited. And just some days ago, I saw at Netflix a documentation about recording technology where you can alter the pitch. So every one of you could go in a studio and record a great pop song, and if it's not so precise an intonation, they will manage that all technically. Yeah, but what could be the danger of the new streaming services, like, for example, Swedish Daniel X Spotify? It is basically the fact that they can be seriously manipulating as well, although it cannot be recognized at first. The popular claim of, for example, Spotify, that one could assemble one's own playlists is a mere fiction, because the offer itself is given by Spotify based on a planned availability through algorithms, and certainly intentionally does not cover the whole scope of music. The streaming services certainly claim that they continuously extend their offerings. And when in 2020 I was asked to put together a thematically specified list, preferably from Spotify, I must admit that I had 80% to add from my personal recording collection because it was not available at Spotify. I don't have problems with that. On the contrary, I was almost very happy because it just confirmed my expectations. But it proved that streaming services like Apple, Spotify, and others are basically mass-orientated. And let us not forget, a compact disc or a vinyl record are objects that can be touched. It is something tactile, representing a value, not to speak about the accompanying booklet of a CD, for example, that provides useful additional information. A playlist is far more abstract. A playlist is perhaps more easily available, but will be more quickly forgotten, and even supports that the potential listener just zaps through the beginning of the pieces without really listening. If one had bought a vinyl, especially an LP, then one was generally more concerned to get full experience of the whole medium, because subconsciously it represented a value as well. It means one has listened in most cases to the complete compositions and did it perhaps more often because the valuable item was still at hand, sustainability. Nevertheless, if we are honest, we have to admit that in today's popular music, the formal dramaturgy of a complete piece is rarely important, exceptions admitted. Sound and danceability are in the foreground. Seen from that point of view, the ephemerality of a standard Spotify playlist is in perfect concordance with popular listening modes. And after an intro, a verse, and a refrain, one has generally grabbed the most important aspects of a song. Real improvised solo passages, like for example in old Santana songs or extended compositions from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, or Genesis, can hardly be found in today's popular genres. Even a Bohemian Rhapsody would not attract so many people as it once did. I'm sure about that. But it should be different with classical concert music. It reminds me to some of my own pieces, which, after a long period of serious scruples, I finally had to put on YouTube. From time to time, I controlled my account with some analytical tools regarding the mode other people tend to listen to my music. Unfortunately, I had to learn that more than 80% do not listen to a single piece from the beginning to the end. But unfortunately, again, I have a compositional method where a 10-minute piece does not reveal its main substance after 3 minutes. Therefore, the perception of a potential listener is not only superficial, but incomplete and partly distorted as well. How can he or she access my music? How can a sustainability can grow in a listener if he or she does not experience the real thing. It resembles me going to a Michelin star restaurant with extended menus, eating just a salad and then writing an elaborate critique on the restaurant and the quality of the food there. Or have I to surrender and only compose digestible 3-minute pieces? Again, we know where we can find something, but we do not really know it. And once again as well, we only understand what we know. And if we do not enlarge our capability of storing knowledge, our brain becomes increasingly limited in differentiating music. It seems that we have to redefine the availability and accessibility of music, or at least we have to put our fingers into the wound of current music perception. Ultimately, it will infect sustainability as well, because nothing will remain a relevant imprint in our neuronal system. Here I see an important task on all educational levels, which is the re-education, to be able and willing to listen to a piece of music in full length, whatever length that is. We should create a kind of musical slow food movement for music perception. You know, slow food movement, which came from Italy, very, very interesting. If music education on an academic level tends to deviate, becoming a mere support of some Olympic prize winners in competitions, I cannot see any sustainability. Competitions may be a relevant side effect for a few prodigies, but our main target should be to develop tools and consciousness to widespread art music in an encompassing way and to train people in the ability to digest music according to the respective needs of a piece. I would also like to mention the fatal reduction of parametrical sensitivity caused by a special type of music and the electronic devices accordingly. In fact, it resembles a kind of devil's circle. Most popular music tends to exist on a quite static parametrical level. Dynamic variation is mostly unknown, and so is it with rhythmical variation. Sound is primarily for identification, including perhaps some melodic elements that are easy to sing along with. All the rest is mostly the packing, using visual media as well. I think you all know that. But what happens with music that is much more differentiated, with complex sound structures, various linear layers, refined rhythmic elements, etc.? Let me that answer with a short anecdote which I had some years ago with a good friend of mine. He was the guitarist of my rock band from the early 70s, and we haven't met for a long time because he worked in a completely different field. But finally, after his work at IBM, he came back and started a career when he was already 60 as a jazz guitarist. So we met some years ago, and he asked me, "No, what kind of music are you doing now?" Can give you a recording, then you listen to it, and you tell me what you think about it. So I gave him one of my beloved pieces. It's called Chamber Music 5, performed by the Musikfabrik, the German ensemble, and conducted by Enno Popper, one of the best conductors you can have. And weeks later, I asked him whether he has already listened to the piece, and his answer was, "Yes, sure." I must admit, it's not my world, but it sounds interesting. I only did not understand that 90-second break in the middle of the piece. 90-second break in the middle of the piece. And as you can imagine, there was no 90-second break. Yeah? There was only a pianissimo passage with bassoon and harp, which he just didn't hear it anymore, yeah? Because he was used to his music, which is always on the same dynamic level. Yeah? So, more about streaming technology now. When in 2020 we all had to find our solutions in overcoming the corona crisis, a colleague of mine and me conducted a seminar at the Lübeck Music University, and we called it the Listening Hour. Based on a certain topic, intentionally limited to all facets of jazz, pop, and rock, and music of the world, students and colleagues should prepare and present a personal playlist at every meeting. The playlist was sent around the day before. With only 2 exceptions, all playlists had been assembled with the help of Spotify, including a reasonable quote of repeated pieces. But we accepted that, as every student had to argue why a special song had been selected. And nobody could know what the other would select. The 2 pieces that did not use Spotify had been myself and our jazz saxophone teacher. No wonder that our playlists differed significantly from the others. And again, around 80% of our selections were completely unknown to the students. And later, my colleague and me rechecked our playlists with Spotify, and what we found out was that this 70 to 80% of our selections was not available as Spotify. So, second case in this regard. That tells me about the young generation, but also about Spotify's self-declared unlimited resources. And it leads also to the question how far the younger generations who draw their information from Spotify and other predetermined forms by those platforms. I have already mentioned streaming services, namely Spotify, and it would be impossible to analyze all the implications and also to compare it with other services that are currently available. Most people would perhaps argue that a service like Spotify is an enrichment regarding all those efforts of developing better accessibility to any kind of music for all people. But is it really a win-win situation? Let us start again even earlier. With the invention of the internet, the idea of a global availability of knowledge seemed to become true. And one would hardly deny that it has become the primary source for any kind of gathering knowledge. No wonder that some people also had the idea of becoming a global distributor for music. And historically, it started with unauthorized services like Napster, for example. And later, it turned into something new. This is from a book. It's called Spotify Teardown by Maria Eriksson and friends, which I can really recommend to learn about the background of those services. A subsequent cultural shift from ownership of recorded music to authorized access of vast music catalogs. Since 2012, this conceptual shift from ownership to access has been accompanied by Spotify's attempt to engineer a shift from access to context, in the sense of using music as such a context for developing a business model based on advertising revenue and subscriptions. So just what the simple what is said here means they have used that system for economic reasons that had nothing to do with the music. Yeah? The latter might seem not unusual. The old record industry advertised and sold records and CDs as well. However, the model here, it has something new because it has no or even less production costs. And it even does not need any more continuously replicated product, but only one data file that can be downloaded endlessly. To be honest, that I can say as a composer, to be honest, the revenues from such downloads are negligible for most artists. It starts to be relevant when you get into the 100,000s, and this work exclusively for a limited amount of popular music artists. In practice, this has often amounted to a model similar to ad-financed newspapers or television, wherein free programming allows the sale of audiences to advertisers. Sale of audiences to advertisers. I think it's a very interesting sentence. For YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, and many other services, this is what the shift from access to context has implied. Hence, understood as a market model, free was premised on the assumption that the exchange of value of cultural production itself could be neglected. Videos, books, music, and personal data could be given away without charge in order to enable platform owners to capitalize on the market they had created. In this view, Spotify has enabled advertisers to benefit from the presence of consumers, while consumers now benefit in their discovery of products and serviced from many advertisers. But what are the benefits for musicians? or cultural producers, more generally, whose content is the incentive attracting both sides. I'm not quite sure what the authors mean with attracting both sides, as I see only one side, the consumers, that give back some benefit. Or the authors mean that the second side is represented by the advertisers, as they profit indirectly from the consumers as well. For me, all this is a serious misunderstanding. If cultural ownership is regarded as a value by itself, then it should not be connected with other interests. I admit that this is perhaps a utopian demand, as commercially produced music is generally made to maximize incomes. And if it is supported by other advertisers with the same orientation, well, why not collaborate? Let's go back to the primary question. Do such processes support the accessibility to music? I strongly doubt it, as the secondary side effects are more dominant, as one is perhaps aware. Another issue is the subconscious guidance of Spotify users. Also, it is known that every 24 hours, around 20,000 new songs are added. Already in 1971, Herbert Simon stated, "What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of the recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate the attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. The audience is constantly unable to make well-informed decisions regarding the consumption of copyright products." End of the quote. It means that the pre-selection services, for example Spotify, are essential, but at the same time include the danger of guiding users into a certain economically relevant direction. And with a certain sarcasm provided by the research team, already quote above, I would like to give you two other examples. The first example refers to an extensive Spotify radio experiment with 160 bots as listeners divided into groups. The first group demanded Dancing Queen, this famous title by ABBA as reference, while the second group chose a less popular radio channel, asking for a less popular piece of similar character called Queen of Darkness, played by the Swedish progressive rock band Rack i Ryggen. Sorry if I pronounce it wrong. Quote, "If a radio loop started with Dancing Queen, it was played again by Spotify radio algorithms after about 50 tracks. Bots listening to a radio station based on Queen of Darkness displayed a similar tendency, but with the difference that the song was not repeated as often as Dancing Queen, and at the longer intervals, regularly after some 70 tracks or so." End of the quote. In other words, the repetitive structure was common to both radio stations, though Spotify radio had a significant shorter interval, which is ultimately commercially more relevant, especially for the big three in music, which is the record companies Universal, Warner Brothers, and Sony. No question that the existence of Spotify was only possible with the collaboration and approval by these three global players. And to avoid misunderstandings, similar mechanisms can also be found in some radio programs, at least in Germany. We heard something different before, but in Germany, we had that. Interestingly, Spotify always argues with its unlimited sources of music, but in fact creates playlists with a very limited variety. Furthermore, the research team could not detect any changing reaction to the suggested playlists, depending on different bot characteristics and feedbacks. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Ericsson writes again, "The claim that the more you personalize, the better the music gets, should be perceived as a mendacious company claim used to attract listeners and stir commercial interest. This topic could be scrutinized further and perhaps almost endlessly. For this context, it's important to understand that neither accessibility nor sustainability are supported or extended by such streaming services. In opposite, conditioning processes through commercially orientated channeling and constricted selections limit the potential access to the diversity of music. By that, the ability of a diverse and differentiated perception process is unconsciously reduced and step by step impedes the digesting as well as the acceptance of unknown music, whether it is from other cultures or very old or contemporary. Consequences for institutions of music education. A future music education must inevitably pay tribute to that dangerous perception situation caused by the massive intruding of electronic media, namely streaming services in our life. If we do not want that our students, and then again the pupils in the classroom, will become acoustic perception robots, then we have to share alternatives with them. I do not have the ideal receipt here, but I strongly believe that musical experience via a diverse musical practice is a key activity in this regard. How to find a balance between a confrontation with a broad palette of musical experience and the quality pressure to achieve highest esteem in musical practice, finding this balance will increasingly become a major task. And we shall not allow that electronic mass media may take over. They shall not be forbidden. That may be the impression that I want to forbid that. Not at all. They shall not be forbidden, but we are obliged as educators to elucidate to people about the dangers and challenges caused by those technologies. Thank you very much. So, I'm open to any kind of questions. Yeah. Graham.
Thank you. I don't know if I should be patient and wait for a microphone, I suppose. I'm not very patient. Thank you. Thank you. I have about 100 comments, so I'm going to ask one question, because I think that's probably decent, right? In relation to the problem of quality perception, what's your sense of, I want to make this a question, not a statement, what's your sense of the advent of the so-called tribute band, where the, in terms of the possible relationship or not to streaming, in that the objective seems to be to sound as close as possible to the original, you know, and they're bands like, you know, they're ABBA tribute bands, etc., and the word tribute is used, which is interesting. But in terms of not presenting the original, or not presenting all that comes with the creativity and the expression, do you have a sense of the impact that the tribute band, particularly given that there are whole festivals of tribute bands? I wonder if you have any comment on that.
I can give you a comment. I must admit that I haven't really studied that in depth with all these consequences, but just spontaneously.
As a composer and as a musician, I wonder what your response to that is.
I would in a way compare that with when we make an interpretation of a Beethoven piano sonata today. For me, it has, it goes for me in this direction. No.
I'm wondering about interpretation, that element of interpretation, if there's a but again,
I would say if they really start to be as close as possible, I think why? Yeah? If you really make an interpretation of something, I expect a kind of individuality as well. So I would argue positively that it's an attempt to make a live music event, which is the most the primary important for me. And the second is, I would critically say it would be good if they start to make this interpretation in a more personal way and not try to come as close as possible. Because there's Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American existentialist, said, the imitator dooms himself to hopeless mediocrity. And that would be for me the same in this case. Yeah? So spontaneously I would feel, oh, well, why not? But just to reflect on it 10 seconds, I would say there would be, I would make a stop line here, said, try to find your personal approach to it. Then that's fine for me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
okay, I have one questions in some way,
Yeah.
because I think you mentioned about the change of the technology
Yeah.
in the past, like 100 years ago when recording appeared,
Mhm.
and somehow like nowadays with Spotify, so somehow the AI, the algorithm that actually
Mhm.
running it, can we take it as the fourth player into this game? So before we had an artist and then the record company, but now besides record companies, we also have all these AI as the third person that now playing also in these marketing games. Do you see any way out of how do we coexist
No,
with this fourth person or third person?
I don't think that we can find a way out. It's just a development which we don't have. We can't control. It's in another dimension of players which we cannot influence. That's why I mean our task as educators is just to make people aware of what is going on, of what is happening. Just that, not more. Yeah? And that I talked about it so extensively and quite critically is just to make people aware of what is happening. We cannot change it, I'm sure, or at least I can't do it. Yeah? And this is a tendency which is global, and there's a tendency which can only be conquered by information to the people. Then it's everyone's decision what to do. I'm not the cultural police of the world. I can only say, look at that, think about it, and then please, it's your decision, how do you continue?
I'm just kind of like trying to think like in the past, I guess like people at the turn of the century must have been a bit...
Which century?
Yeah, let's say the 100 year before, the 100 year, like early...
Around 1900.
1900,
Yeah.
something like that. When recording technology appears, then they must kind of like felt a bit like us now, I guess. But at the end of the century, it seems like artists, composers are making use of this technology as part of their creations. So I'm just wondering, in the future, apart from using AI to ChatGPT to kind of compose the piece for you, but this algorithm, can it be part of the creation?
That's a completely different level. If it becomes a part of a creative activity, then it's for me something different. Yeah, this is another word. I'm speaking about the industry of it, yeah, which suggests in a mass style to globally to all the people. But if in the moment you use this technology to make a creative process out of it, that could be interesting. I would personally not be interested, but I can imagine that there are artists who have a great ability to work in this direction. I certainly would accept that. These are for me two completely different fields, yeah, which I don't want to put together.
Yes. I'm glad
Wo war das? Ah ja.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for delivering it with a passion. That's so lovely to see. My question is, and I've got a couple of questions, but I'll just ask about one, which is about about music and sound. And it's actually related to a lot of things you mentioned, that because, you know, with blurring of copyright and this whole ownership and so forth, at the same time, we have nowadays more sound-related topics and things and everything than what is perhaps called music. Or sometimes music is called, it's called music, but it's basically about some kind of a sound, managed sound rather than organized sound. How, and in my own area, both as a teacher and as a player, I also noticed that there are more people working in the field of sound rather than in the field of music, to the extent that, you know, in the past, let's say 30 years ago, 80% of people were working in music and then 20% more in the area of sound, whereas now it's 50-50, if not more people working in the area of sound. And I'm talking about not only just sound installation and sound artists, but environmental sound and so forth. How do you see, from your point of view as a composer, but also working in many different situations, different places, and different roles, the relationship between music and sound today?
Oh, whoa. Now it becomes very philosophical. First, I would like to say from my point of view, I think I know precisely what you mean. But even then, I would like to say that I don't see this dichotomy, sound and music, because sound is ultimately part of music. It's a musical parameter. How do you create sound with the color of the instrument, with the harmonization, whatever? That's a technical problem. But sound is part of musical parameters like duration, pitch, articulation, sound. Yeah, you can also take harmony, whatever. These are the parameters. And but I agree with you that in many recent works of the younger generation, maybe, this parameter sound is dominating, more giving the atmosphere what I called a kind of wallpaper. So it creates a kind of ambient where you move, where you do something else, and that becomes apparently popular, this kind of ambient character, which is an art form which I have to accept. It's not my world, but I accept it, and I know that it's quite dominant at the moment. I have my personal arguments why, but as I'm not yet ready in my thoughts about that, I don't want to say them now. But I think I can accept that as long as the other more, let's say now, conservative type of composition is still existing and accepted. Then it's fine for me. Yeah? But if this really becomes a kind of cultural debate between, that's why I don't like this dichotomy music sound. Yeah? It's just if a composer, then take György Ligeti, when he composed in the late 50s Atmospheres. It's a sound piece. It's a 100% sound piece. How he has achieved that sound, that's another question. Yeah? But it's actually a piece that only works with sound. Or take Presque Rien from Luc Ferrari, something like that, for example. These are sound pieces. And so it's, in a way, nothing new. Maybe the new media with laptops and software enable young composers very quickly to achieve something which sounds exciting. Yeah, but that may be perhaps just a first step in a further development. I had a lot of students who came to me with a laptop and something like that. And then I said, hey, it's fine, you can continue that, but I would like to try something else with you. And normally they accept that, and they work in parallel in the two lines. And let's say half of them then became more interested than in other parameters. Others just kept on their way, and they then also looked for a new teacher, because I'm not the right teacher for that. Yeah, maybe not satisfying, my answer. For myself, I'm still working with that to find a comprehensive answer for myself. Yeah? But it's interesting. The only thing I would ask, don't make this dichotomy music sound. I think that doesn't bring us further on. Yeah? Okay. Okay, Anotai, was that?
We can have a little break after this, and I think you should continue in this room, I'm afraid, because the rain outside looks like our future in a way. So continue to maybe kind of like move a little bit, and then thank you very much, Dieter, for your thought-provoking. I think it is. Yeah, thank you very much.